The blue folder was still sitting on his desk when they announced his name instead of mine. I remember the exact weight of that folder because I built it myself. Leadership transition, printed in bold letters on the tab. 9 months of tabs and color-coded sections. 9 months of my evenings turned into someone else's future. Evan Mercer stood up when the CEO called his name, and he smiled the way people smile when they already know the ending of the movie. He shook hands. He nodded at the applause. Then he turned toward me across the room and said, into the microphone, in front of 40 people, "Thank you to Naomi for such a well-organized training process." Well-organized. Like I had color-coded his promotion for him. I clapped because that is what you do in that room, in that company, in Chicago, in a marketing agency where the windows are floor to ceiling and the coffee machine costs more than my first car. I clapped and I felt my own hands go through the motion like they belonged to someone paid to perform loyalty. Nobody in that room asked why the person who trained the new regional director wasn't considered for the job herself. Nobody asked because the answer was already sitting quietly under the surface of every meeting I had sat through for the last 2 years. I want you to understand something before I go further. This isn't a story about one bad day. It's a story about a pattern, and patterns don't announce themselves. They just repeat until you finally count them. The promotion itself wasn't the wound. It was just the moment the wound finally had a name. I'd been at that agency for 6 years, working my way up by being the person who could handle whatever landed on the desk. Evan joined in my 3rd year, hired laterally, with a confident handshake and a habit of using the word vision in almost every sentence. He shadowed me on 2 accounts when he started, which was normal. What wasn't normal was how long it lasted. 2 months turned into a year, and nobody ever formally ended it, so I just kept training him, quietly, alongside my own job. The badge with the golden ribbon arrived that same afternoon. 10 minutes later, someone from marketing asked me to gather everyone for a quick team photo. I did it, arranged people by height, and stood at the edge of the frame myself, because somebody has to hold the phone. 3 weeks before the announcement, we were in a strategy meeting with the whole account team. I laid out a plan to restructure how we handled our top 5 clients, built over a weekend, with numbers and timelines. Evan listened, nodded along, and then, when the VP asked for his opinion, he said, "Naomi's great at keeping things organized." Strategy is where leadership starts. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone heard the insult, but nobody wants to be the one who names it. I kept talking. I finished my presentation. Nobody remembers the plan. Everybody remembers that sentence. A month after that, we brought in Harrington Foods, a client worth more to the agency than half our other accounts combined. I ran that meeting, answering every hard question about budget and timeline. At one point, Marcus Webb, their marketing director, asked a pointed question about attribution modeling that clearly caught Evan off guard, and I answered it in under 30 seconds, from memory. Evan added a few sentences here and there, mostly agreeing with things I had already said in different words. When the client left, their director shook Evan's hand at the door. "Excellent leadership today," he said. He didn't look at me. I was already stacking the leftover printouts, because someone has to, and it is apparently always me. 2 weeks after that, HR called me into a small office with a window that faced the parking garage. Priya from HR, kind in the vague way people are kind when they know something you don't, asked if I would be willing to prepare Evan a bit more for a potential leadership transition. I asked what that meant exactly. She said it was just a formality, just making sure the team had continuity, tapping a closed folder of her own on the desk like it was reminding her of something she wasn't going to say out loud. The promotion was announced 12 days later. So when he stood there thanking me for a well-organized training process, I understood, finally, completely, that I hadn't been training my successor. I had been training my replacement. The two things sound the same until you're the one holding the folder. That evening I stayed at my desk longer than I meant to. By the time I left, the office was almost empty, just the cleaning crew and the hum of the building settling into itself. I got to my car before I realized I'd left my phone charger under my desk. I went back up. The badge reader let me in without asking questions, because the system doesn't know your career just ended, it only knows your access level. The lights in the main conference room were still on. Someone had left the wall screen running, the leftover glow of a Teams call still displayed after the meeting had ended. I wasn't trying to read anything. I walked past the glass wall on my way to get my charger, and the screen was simply there, at eye level, impossible not to see. A message sat open in a chat titled Leadership Decision from the Vice President, Richard Doyle, the same man who signed every company-wide email with a quote about teamwork to two other directors. Glad we moved Naomi out of consideration. Evan is easier to manage, and she already built the client base anyway. I stood in the hallway and read it twice. Below the chat, a PDF was still open, the kind of document that never gets shown to the person it's about. Final candidate evaluations. My name at the top of a short list. Leadership score, highest of all candidates. Beside it, in red, a single line. Too independent for current management structure. I didn't feel the anger the way you'd expect. I felt something closer to clarity, the kind that arrives cold and doesn't ask permission. My hands weren't shaking. I took my phone out of my bag and I photographed the screen. Both documents, clearly, the timestamp saving itself in the corner, 8:47 p.m. Then I got my charger and I went home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for almost 10 minutes before I started the engine. I just looked at the two photographs on my phone until the words stopped feeling new and started feeling like something I could use. I didn't tell anyone that week. Not my sister, not my closest friend at work, not even the version of myself that usually narrates everything out loud while making dinner. I put the two photos in a folder on my phone that I didn't name anything, just left it blank, the way you leave a door unmarked so nobody thinks to open it. For the next several weeks, I went to work like nothing had changed. I answered emails. I sat through meetings where Evan used words like synergy and ownership, words that meant nothing until you needed them to sound like leadership. I did my job with the same competence I always had, because sloppiness would have been the first thing people noticed, and I needed nobody noticing anything about me for a while. There was a Tuesday, about 10 days after the screen in the conference room, when Evan called an all-hands meeting to introduce what he called his new client engagement framework. It was almost line for line, a restructuring plan I had proposed 8 months earlier in a memo that had gone unanswered at the time. He presented it as his own thinking, his own initiative, and the VP who'd once written that message about moving me out of consideration nodded along approvingly from the back of the room. He'd even kept my original slide layout, the same color scheme, the same order of bullet points, just with different fonts and his name in the header instead of mine. I sat near the front and took notes like everyone else, and when Evan asked if anyone had questions, I raised my hand and asked one clarifying question about implementation timeline, purely functional, purely professional. He answered it. Nobody in that room knew they were watching a man present my own idea back to me for approval. Afterward, none of it left my mouth. Saying it out loud would have made it a complaint, and complaints get you labeled exactly the way that red comment on the evaluation had already labeled me. In that building, independence wasn't a compliment. It meant a person who might eventually stop asking for permission. What I did instead, quietly, on my own time, was start making calls. I have a recruiter I've known for years, a woman named Denise who moved from agency work into headhunting and never looked back. I called her on a Tuesday evening and told her I might be open to something new. She didn't ask why. She just asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted a place where the person doing the work and the person getting credit for it were the same person. Denise laughed, not unkindly, and said that was the single most common request she got and also the hardest one to actually deliver on. She sent me 3 names within the hour, all agencies within driving distance, all mid-sized firms competing for the same tier of client my current agency served. 2 of them wanted a phone screen first. The third wanted me in a room immediately. 2 weeks later, I had an interview at Holloway Strategic, a competitor firm 3 blocks north, smaller than my current agency but growing fast, mostly by taking clients nobody expected them to take. Before that interview, I did something practical. I paid a lawyer $200 an hour to read my non-solicitation agreement and tell me exactly what I could and couldn't do once I left. The language was fairly standard for the industry. I couldn't call clients directly and ask them to move their business. I couldn't offer incentives. What I could do, she said, was leave. Cleanly, quietly, on good terms, and let whatever happened next happen on its own. Nothing in that contract could stop a client from deciding, on their own, who they wanted to keep working with. That distinction turned out to matter more than anything else in the story. The interview happened in a small conference room overlooking the Chicago River. The man across the table was Graham Holloway himself, the founder, mid-50s, gray at the temples. Before we started, he lined up the 3 pens on the table, perfectly parallel. "Let's deal with facts, not egos," he said, and asked me to walk him through my last 3 years of client work, numbers only, no adjectives. I gave him numbers. Retention rates. Revenue growth on accounts I'd personally managed. At one point I mentioned a client we'd nearly lost during a product recall, rebuilt over 6 weeks of near-daily calls, some of them on a weekend I was supposed to spend at my sister's wedding shower. Graham stopped writing and looked at me. "Most people would have let that account go," he said. It wasn't a question. He didn't say anything encouraging or vague. He said, "That's a strong track record," and asked one more question. "Why isn't a person with this record already a director somewhere?" I told him the truth. The company I currently work for promoted someone else into the role I'd been training him for, and put the reason in writing, something about not fitting the current management structure. Graham nodded slowly, like he'd heard some version of that sentence before. He didn't ask me to explain further. He just said, "We don't have that problem here," and got up to make 2 coffees himself instead of calling his assistant to do it. 3 days later I had a written offer. Vice President of Client Strategy. A number on the salary line that made me sit very still in my kitchen before I could react. I signed it on a Thursday, Graham sliding the contract across the table without ceremony, like this was simply the correct outcome of a correct process. I gave notice at my current job exactly 2 weeks later, once the paperwork on the new offer had fully cleared and my start date was locked in writing. I didn't want to hand anyone a reason to question my timeline, or worse, a reason to walk me out early without the clean transition I'd already decided I wanted. Meanwhile, back at my current job, something else had started happening, something smaller and harder to name. Evan had started coming to my office more often. Not for anything specific. He'd lean against the door frame and ask how a certain account was going, or mention something about the quarterly numbers, and then, almost as an afterthought, he'd ask if everything was okay. "You seem different lately," he said once, standing there with his coffee mug that had his new title printed on it in small gold letters. "Everything's under control," I told him, and went back to my screen. He wasn't wrong that something had changed. He just didn't know what, and I wasn't going to be the one who told him. I gave my notice through the proper channels on a Monday morning with the standard letter, the standard 2 weeks converted into the standard month required by my contract. HR processed it the way HR processes everything, with a form and a polite meeting and a question about an exit interview. I agreed to it, then answered in the vaguest possible language, because none of it was theirs to have yet. The HR representative who ran that exit interview was Priya, the original one, the same woman who'd once asked me to prepare Evan a bit more for the leadership transition. She asked, gently, whether I felt I'd been treated fairly during my time at the company. I looked at her for a moment, thinking about the screen in the conference room and that red comment, and I said, "I feel like I learned a lot here." It was true, and it was also nothing, and she wrote it down without pushing further, because that's usually how these conversations end, both people understanding exactly what isn't being said. Evan found out about my resignation the same way everyone else did, through an internal announcement 2 days after I'd already submitted it. He came to my office that afternoon, closed the door, which he almost never did, and asked me directly if this had anything to do with him. I told him it had everything to do with an opportunity one couldn't turn down, which was also true, and also nothing, in exactly the same way. He stood there for a moment longer than the conversation needed, looking at the framed print on my wall, a map of Chicago I'd bought my first year at the company. Then he asked, quieter this time, if the new place was better. I told him I'd know in a few months. He nodded, said congratulations, and left without closing the door behind him the way he'd opened it. During that final month, I did my job exactly as well as I always had. I didn't sabotage a single account. I didn't badmouth Evan to a single client. I answered every email, closed out every project cleanly, and left detailed notes for whoever would inherit my accounts. I remember spending an entire Sunday afternoon writing a transition document for Harrington Foods specifically, laying out contact preferences, campaign history, and a list of small details that never make it into any CRM. Like the fact that Marcus Webb hated being copied on more than 3 people in an email thread, or that he answered faster on Thursdays than any other day of the week. I wanted my exit to be undeniable in its professionalism, because the story that came after needed a clean beginning, not a messy one. On my last day, nobody threw a party. A few people from the account team took me to lunch at a place 2 blocks from the office. One of them, a young account coordinator named Marisol, cried a little and said she learned more from watching me run a client call than from 2 years of formal training. That was the only moment that whole month that made my throat tighten. Evan sent a company-wide email that afternoon thanking me for my contributions and wishing me well in my next chapter, the kind of message HR probably had a template for. Nobody replied to it directly. A few people stopped by my desk on their way out that evening, just to shake my hand, without saying much of anything, which somehow felt more honest than the email had. One of them left a sticky note on my monitor that just said, "Thank you for actually teaching me things," no signature, and I still have it in a drawer somewhere. I started at Holloway Strategic on a Monday in early spring. My new office had a smaller window than my old one and about a third of the furniture, because Graham believed in growth funding itself instead of decor, and I liked that about him immediately. My first week there, he called a short meeting with the whole client strategy team, 6 people around a table that could have seated 10. He introduced me by listing exactly what I'd be responsible for, no vague language, no talk of potential or fit. Then he said something I hadn't heard from a superior in longer than I wanted to admit. If a client asks for Naomi specifically, he said, that request goes to Naomi, not around her. Nobody in that room questioned it. Graham had a habit of stating expectations once, clearly, and never repeating himself, which somehow made people more careful about remembering the first time. I spent those early weeks rebuilding processes from nothing, the same kind of work I'd once poured into a blue folder for someone else's benefit. Except this time, every system I built stayed attached to my own name in the company's records. I kept a running list, half joking, of every place a client's preference or a campaign detail lived only in my head, and turned each one into something written down, searchable, shared, so that if I ever got hit by a bus, the accounts wouldn't collapse with me. Nobody asked me to do that. I did it because I finally trusted that the credit would still be there when I looked up again. It felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, the way new shoes feel before they've been broken in. I kept waiting for someone to take credit for something I'd built, and nobody did, and eventually I stopped waiting. What happened next wasn't a plan I orchestrated. The version of this story that would be easiest to tell is the version where I called up my old clients one by one and convinced them to follow me. That isn't what happened, and it wouldn't have been legal, and more importantly, it wasn't necessary. The truth is simpler and slower than that, and it took most of a quarter to fully show itself. The first call came about 5 weeks after I started. Marcus Webb, the marketing director at Harrington Foods, the same client I'd spent that meeting essentially running by myself while Evan collected the handshake. He called my old office looking for me, was told I no longer worked there, and got my new number from someone who still had it, someone who wasn't going to pretend loyalty to a company over a colleague. Marcus called Holloway Strategic directly. He said, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, that he'd never really understood who at the old agency was actually running his account until I left, and the calls stopped making sense. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Evan had asked him twice in one call to repeat a budget figure he'd already sent in writing 3 separate times. 2 more clients followed within the next 2 months. Not because I asked. Because the person answering their calls at my old agency suddenly wasn't able to answer the questions the way I always had, and clients noticed that faster than any executive team expects them to. One of them, a woman named Colette Ashford who ran marketing for a regional furniture chain, told me about it over lunch a few weeks after her account moved to Holloway Strategic. She'd tried for 3 straight months to get a straight answer out of Evan about a delayed campaign launch. Every time she asked a direct question, she said, he'd redirect her to someone junior on his team, someone who clearly didn't have the authority to actually change anything. At one point, she said, she'd asked for a simple revised timeline and received 3 conflicting answers from 3 different people in the same week. She said she finally asked, point blank, in a meeting whether Naomi was still involved in her account in any capacity. When the answer was no, she started making calls of her own. I didn't orchestrate a single one of those conversations. It felt strange watching a version of justice arrive that I hadn't built with my own hands, one that simply happened because the truth about who actually did the work finally had nowhere left to hide. By the end of the quarter, 3 of the agency's 5 largest accounts had either left entirely or requested to move their business to Holloway Strategic specifically. That's not a coincidence you can explain away with market conditions. That's what happens when you build a training folder for someone and forget to also transfer the actual relationships, because relationships were never something you could put in a binder in the first place. Graham mentioned it once in passing, almost offhandedly, that the numbers had started attracting attention from a few other clients who hadn't even been asked. I heard about the board meeting secondhand weeks later from Marisol, who'd heard it from someone in finance who'd been in the room. The quarterly review happened on a Thursday. The CFO, Walter Simmons, a person known around the building for never raising his voice even when he should, put the numbers up on the screen. 3 major accounts lost within a single quarter, a significant percentage of annual revenue. The CEO turned to Evan. Why didn't we know these relationships depended on Naomi? Evan didn't have an answer that satisfied anyone in that room. He said something about client onboarding, something about a transition plan still in progress. 9 months into the role, that answer didn't sit well with anyone. Then the director of sales, Renata Cole, the kind of person who always kept a bowl of hard candy on her desk for anyone who stopped by, pulled up the CRM history for each lost account. In every single record, going back years, the primary contact logged for every meaningful interaction was my name. Every renewal conversation. Every crisis call at 9 p.m. Every single line of contact history mine. Walter Simmons reportedly took off his glasses and looked at the screen a second time, slower, like he needed to read it twice to believe the pattern had been there the whole time. Priya from HR apparently looked down at her own notes during that part of the meeting. Somewhere in her files was the evaluation with that same red comment, the one I'd photographed off a screen months earlier. She didn't say anything out loud. She didn't need to. One of the outside board members said one sentence into the silence. We promoted the wrong person. Nobody corrected him. Marisol told me later that the meeting dragged on another 40 minutes, the CEO asking for a recovery plan Evan couldn't really deliver. 2 of the 3 accounts had already signed with Holloway Strategic by the time he started making calls. I wasn't there for any of it. While that meeting was happening, I was 3 blocks south, in a conference room with a wide window, walking a new client through a proposal. I watched a director nod the way people nod when they're finally being spoken to by someone who actually understands their business, not someone just repeating summaries. Evan called me 2 days after that meeting. I let it go to voicemail the first time, mostly out of habit rather than strategy. He called again an hour later. I picked up on the 3rd ring. He asked if we could meet, in person, somewhere neutral, not the office. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what he thought a meeting could still fix. We met at a coffee shop near the river, the kind of place with exposed brick and overpriced pastries that nobody actually orders. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on him before, the confidence from the announcement 9 months earlier completely gone from his face. He offered me a number. A significant raise over what I'd been making before, plus a title, senior director this time, plus what he called a seat at the table going forward. We can fix this, he said, leaning forward slightly. There was nothing to fix, I told him. You already made your decision. He started to say something about how things had changed, how the board saw things differently now. I let him finish, put a $5 bill on the table for my coffee, and told him I hoped the rest of the quarter went better for him. I meant it more than people probably expect. Then I walked out. A few days later, my final box of belongings arrived at my apartment, forwarded through the building's mailroom. Under a stapler and an old team photo was the blue folder, Leadership Transition, the tab still intact, exactly the way I'd left it on Evan's desk almost a year earlier. I sat on my kitchen floor with it open on my lap for a while, looking at pages I'd built during a period of my life I'd once believed was leading somewhere specific. It had led somewhere better, just not through the door I'd been aiming at. The following week, I gave it to Julissa, a new coordinator we'd just hired, 24, who reminded me a little of myself at that age. It used to be a training guide for someone else's promotion, I told her. It could be something different now, a lesson in building something real enough that people follow the person, not the title. A year later, Julissa got her own promotion, based on a client renewal she'd handled start to finish. Graham set her name in front of the whole team and let her take the applause without a single sentence about who had trained her. That was the whole lesson, finally landed where it belonged. People follow the person, never the title. That's what the blue folder means now. Was it fair, what I did? I didn't call a single client. I didn't break a single clause in that contract. I just left, cleanly, and let the truth of who actually built those relationships speak for itself once I was gone. Some people would say that's just consequences catching up to a decision that was already unfair. Others might say I could have fought harder instead of making an exit. Tell me what you would have done in that hallway, standing in front of that screen at 8:47 p.m., with your own name sitting on an evaluation that called you too independent to lead. If this story felt true to you, even a little, hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming, and I want you here for every single one of them.